The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, and welcome to a conversation with Brock Thoene, who, with his wife Bodie, has written a series of historical novels, primarily on World War II and the American West. And today we're going to talk about The Twilight of Courage, his most recent, or their most recent book, which depicts the life of exciting times of 10 months in the very beginning of World War II, from the invasion of Poland to the Dunkirk episode, just prior to the great battle for Britain. I'd like to get into as quickly as possible, because I'm terribly interested in why the title, The Twilight of Courage, which implies, as I think we discussed earlier, maybe either an ironic twist or that courage somehow was not present. And of course it was there in ample.
Well, the first thing is, of course, a historic reference. The period of time between the invasion of Poland and the Nazi blitzkrieg that rolled across Holland and Belgium is variously referred to as the Twilight War or the Phony War, sometimes called the Sitzkrieg. It was a period of time where the Allies abandoned Poland to its fate and let the Nazis take it, and then sat behind the Maginot Line thinking, well, that's all the further Germany is going to go, and so they were technically at war, but nothing much was going on. So the Twilight War, that played a factor in the title. But I think the other thing is, there was a period of time prior to this when Hitler could have been stopped. There were so many missed opportunities where the Allies could have prevented him from rolling over all of Europe and did not do so. And so the sun was really setting on Europe. The descent into the period of the war was really inevitable by the period of time covered in Twilight of Courage. And so that darkness was creeping across the whole world at that point. It is at that moment in time, though, that some individuals, some people who did not think of themselves as heroic, really became shining lights, stood out against the darkness as examples of courage. So I think all of those things roll into the idea behind the title.
It's an interesting choice, especially in the light of the fact that you've written so many other books.
Well,
on World War II and what leads up to. Mm-hmm. Is that the reason, or do you plan? Well, let's identify them: Vienna Prelude, Munich Signature, and Prague Counterpoint, all of which had to do with events leading up to
just prior to the war, right? Yeah, they're all part of a 6-book series called the Zion Covenant, and they do recount the descent into the Nazi grip on Europe that we were just speaking about. And they cover the period of time from 1937 right up to the outbreak of the war in September of 1939. And that really kind of set up what we are writing about in Twilight of Courage, because this book does take off historically right where the Covenant series ends.
A question then about a procedure here. How do you divide things up? Who does, let's say, the historical analysis necessary to even begin a rather large enterprise like this?
Well, Bodie and I are often asked, in fact, and you're maybe too polite to ask it this way, Scott, but how do you work together and still stay friends and stay married, together all the time? And part of the answer is we have a really clear division of responsibilities. I do the historical background research. It's my job to develop the milestones, if you will, the bookends of the story. In this particular case, Twilight of Courage begins with the Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. We knew that it was going to go through the miraculous evacuation from Dunkirk in 1940. And so then within those two beginning and ending points, we look for the historic things that we are going to encounter along the way. It sort of sets up a framework for the book. And then I turn that over to Bodie, and she does then the creative effort of peopling the story, of putting the characters into that, knowing this is what they would see on a particular day, here are things that they would encounter or be affected by, and so on. So that's really the way the relationship works.
Okay, now you do the research all by yourself, or do you get some help?
We're very fortunate to have help. In the case of Twilight of Courage, we had 4 college-age research assistants, 2 of whom happened to be our sons, Jake and Luke.
Oh, super.
And 2 other college students as well. We were in Europe actually for 5 months researching, and they were digging into some dusty archives, and we think that's some of the most fun involved in the project. Just to give you, for instance, there are some really terrific photos of what happened on the beaches in Dunkirk. But as you know, a photographer may shoot 10 rolls of film, and yet he only publishes 1 or 2 photographs out of that whole set. Well, those others don't disappear. They are often collected into photo morgues, into archives, that then maybe don't see the light of day, in this particular case, for 50 or 60 years. We have access to those, and so our research assistants have some guidance from us. We say, we want you to go into this time period, you're looking for this specific subject, and we want the most dramatic photos you can find, things that really in themselves tell stories. And so then they go through, locate those, and they do an excellent job, did a terrific job with Twilight of Courage, and we get reproductions of the photos then that then we can use to actually, you know, 1 photograph, they say, is worth 1,000 words, and sometimes we can take a photograph and turn it into 1,000 words of story.
It occurs to me that you have a tremendous advantage writing at this time and about that period because of the photographs. If you were writing about, let's say, something prior to the invention of photography, other than an occasional oil painting, you were pretty much on your own or word description, so I'm sure that's a big
The photographs are a great source. The other thing is, and this has to do with, again, the question about why this particular time period, we have a real sense of urgency, really, about telling these stories because there are still people who live through those experiences. Now, many of them are in their 70s and 80s, so right now is the opportunity to get their stories recorded, to visit with them. Just again, for instance, we interviewed a woman who was on the road as a refugee with 2 million others, fleeing out of Belgium ahead of the Nazi blitzkrieg. She had 6 children, some of whom were her own, some that she was just responsible for. They had no transportation. The roads were clogged both ways with refugees going one direction and the French military trying to move the other. There was no transportation other than on foot. There were no supplies. There were no public services. There was nobody around to say, well, you know, there was no Red Cross organization present to help out. She was literally drawing on her own resources and her personal faith to see her and those children through to safety. That's a dramatic story, well worth hearing, and what we also feel is well worth recounting, seeing that it isn't lost.
It occurred to me. This may sound a bit like the wise guy and so forth, but there's almost a traffic management problem in this, in that you have so many characters. This is on the scale of A War and Peace in terms of people. You almost have to have a cast list in the beginning,
right, exactly, yeah,
to help people keep things separated. And yet in each one of those stories, not only do you orchestrate those well, and so that it's relatively easy to follow if you pay any attention to it, and it's a good read. It's what I would call a rattling good yarn.
Oh, great!
And it's fun to read, and it good Lord, it keeps moving. But it occurs to me that someone almost has to be a traffic cop to figure out where these people go.
Yeah, I think that is simplified by the fact that many of the characters, most in fact, are real people. And so when you're telling the stories of real people, then we know, of course, where they were and where they went and what happened to them and so on. And so it's not like we have to say now, you know, if we're making it up, well, what happened to this person in relation to somebody else and keeping that all even. But since they're real, then we just, you know, retell what really happened. The only exception to that, in fact, is that sometimes some of our main characters have to be observers to or participants in events that they just couldn't have been. They could not be 2 places at once, for instance. And so we do take the liberty of composite characters where we'll take the stories of 2 or more people and mesh them together to get the kind of perspective that we need.
How long did it take you to write it?
It took about a year, actually, around 8 months of research and about 4 months of writing.
Boy, and again, who's the one that sits down at the at the typewriter or the
Bodie has that
word
pleasure.
processor? So in other words, she's the wordsmith.
She is, absolutely right.
And then you help in the editing? And
yeah, one of the things that we do in working together is that we start off with requiring of ourselves 5 finished pages a day. Now, you yourself as a writer and others watching who write know what I mean when I say finished pages. Very seldom do we just do 5 pages. Often that'll be 15 or 20 pages to get to the 5 that we will keep. But that's the demand we make of ourselves in the early going of writing. And we do that by writing a section and then I read it back aloud. And one of the things we are told by readers is that the book has, the writing has very much natural cadences to it, that it is, if you read aloud, it will sound good in the ear, and that's also pleasing when you read it. And the speech patterns are natural and so forth. And that's how we achieve that, actually, is that the very first reading is out loud, and we listen for unnatural cadence, or we listen for repetition of words, overusing a particular word or phrase, and we fix that right then. So when we say finished pages, we often literally will do the 5 pages and then we will never work on them again. They're actually concluded and put away.
It occurs to me that you handle dialogue well because you have a background in the motion picture.
That's, I think, certainly a part of it. We did get our start working for John Wayne and Bat Jack Productions. And I want to make it really clear that we were very low on the totem pole. We were very young writers and researchers, and we're very privileged to be part of that organization. But we do credit that experience for the differences in a lot of what we know about dialogue and constructing a story. John Wayne was a master storyteller working in film, but what we like to do is apply what he said about that business to our writing. He said, if you're going to have people interested in a story, you have to compound it of action and adventure. It has to have a little romance. It has to make people feel like they are transported to a different time and place. And you have to care about the characters. They have to be people that you are interested in. You know, you want to know what happens to them. Otherwise, you could have the greatest plot in the world, but nobody would care. And so if that comes through in the writing, then we owe a great deal of credit to him and his teaching.
What characters do you think you'll use again?
I think probably the one that we absolutely know we will see again in future books is the character of David Mayer. He's an American pilot, as you know, in Twilight of Courage. He's flying for the RAF, and since we are going on from this story into what we believe will be retelling the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, we will almost certainly have a use for a flyer again. He's, again, based on a real man, and we have written about him before. He's actually been in some of our earlier works as well, so he has become a real spokesperson for us in a lot of ways.
I'm interested in one character that is, I think, very intriguing in this, and that's the character of Lewinsky, the cryptographer,
right,
or whatever, the people that worked on the Enigma machine.
Right, yeah. One of the stories that, and let me digress for just a moment, Winston Churchill said, "Isn't it amazing on what tiny hinges the great events of history turn?" And by that he meant, you know, unexpected, unplanned events that affected much more dramatic outcomes than you would think from just the nature of the event itself. And one of those is the whole business of Enigma. The fact that the Allies were able to intercept and decode German military radio traffic had a lot to do with ultimately the Allied victory. Even years later at, you know, with the cross-channel invasion and D-Day, there was much deception that went on and misleading the Germans as to Allied intent. And the way that the Allies were able to see that that was working was that they would hear the radio traffic coming back from the Germans and were able to uncode it. And that was not only a technical achievement, it was also a masterful achievement of espionage, because through all that period of time, the Germans never knew that the Allies had this capability. Well, Richard Lewinsky was a Polish Jew. He actually worked in the German factory where they were building Enigma machines pre-war, and somehow slipped out of Nazi vision. And then they discovered that he had so much information and pursued him actively across Europe. But he did get to France. He was involved in the whole decoding operation that ultimately affected the whole outcome of the war.
And what happened to him?
Well, he disappeared. He's a very enigmatic figure. We know that he went as far as England. We can trace him there. It is believed, from what we've been able to uncover, that for his own safety, he's fleeing the Gestapo, that he changed his name and his identity. May in fact have ended up in America, but that's going to take some more digging before we can prove that one way or the other.
Meat for another novel, I'm sure.
Exactly right, yeah.
When did you start writing these historical novels?
We've been writing the historicals for about 10 years now. In fact, the first one was part of a series called the Zion Chronicles, and book one was The Gates of Zion. That came out in 1986, so it was about 10 years ago right now that we were writing it.
Same publisher all the way?
No, the new book, Twilight of Courage, is with Thomas Nelson. That's our first book with him.
This is maybe an aside too, but I'm interested in the possibilities. There's a lot of what I would say the scenes you set here are visually accessible to the reader. They don't have to work very hard to get the picture of what's going on, and that of course makes it a lot more interesting. Any possibility of any of your work winding up on screen?
In film. Well, as you
or
know,
on miniseries.
Yeah,
I think this is not a theatrical.
That's our sense of that too. It would be really tough, I think, to tell this broad a story in one film. But as you know, our background is in film. We have kind of a wary sense, I think would be the best way to describe it. We have been approached with some of the other books about the possibility of film projects. We have also seen some really good books turned into some kind of mediocre films, so we're a little hesitant about that. If the timing was right, you know, I think it could be really great. There are wonderful stories. They really deserve to be retold and go back into a the most visual form. Our most recent connection with that actually has been with our sons. If you don't mind me giving them a little plug. Jake and Luke have collaborated on a screenplay. It's a juvenile action-adventure series called The Last Chance Detectives, and that has already been produced. Episode 1 is in the bookstores right now, and then they also did the novelization of their own script. So they have a videotape and a book out right now themselves.
And are they still in college?
Yes, they're both in college. Jake's studying film in London, right?
Where do you live?
We live in Lake Tahoe.
Yeah. Oh my!
I know it's tough.
But someone's got to do it.
Somebody's got to do it.
When did you and Bodie decide to team up and start writing books?
Actually, we've always worked together. We've been married 24 years this December 1994, and our partnership started early on. Bodie started as a freelance writer. Actually, she was working as an intern for U.S. News, and I think that maybe helps explain the collaboration also, by the way. Any kind of a news gathering organization consists of a research department and a writing department where one feeds into the other, and that's exactly the relationship we work with. And so the partnership goes back that far, and then the historical writing, as we said, is about 10 years old right now.
And are you both from California?
Yeah, we grew up actually 3 blocks from each other.
Whereabouts?
So we in Bakersfield, of all places.
Holy buckets, Bakersfield, okay. Well, in sitting down to choose a subject, now, admittedly you've sort of zeroed in on World War II, but when you made the decision to write The Twilight of Courage, was there a process where you sat around and said to yourself, what's the next period, and if we pick one, what's got to happen in that period to give us what we need to work with?
Yeah, we do have that sort of discussion, and there's a lot that feeds into it. The first one, to be really fair to the people and give them the credit, Twilight of Courage, as picking a time period, came really from the readers, because they expressed to us after we finished the Zion Covenant series, they said, we want to know more about that time period. We got hundreds of letters saying, are you going to go on and tell the story of the war? So that was a big motivation. But the other thing is, Bodie and I both have an interest in history, always have had, going clear back into our school days, and the sense that Americans in general really don't have a good handle on the events of the middle of this century. And we're talking about the most dramatic time period of the 20th century, certainly the period of time that has affected everything since in the century that we're living in, and yet most often in our grade school and college history classes, that is the period of time that gets short shrift we get right up to that, it seems, you know, in course after course, and then it kind of runs out. You know, you just run out of time, and you never really get to explore the time period. And just to give you an example of why we can say that it is so critical, Twilight of Courage begins with the Nazi invasion of Poland, as we said. So the war then was precipitated by the issue of Poland. Now, the Allies did not go to Poland's rescue, and so that the war then developed more fully. But here's the key. 6 years later, when the war in Europe came to a conclusion, Poland was still not free. It just changed hands. It went from being possessed by Nazi Germany to being possessed by the Soviet Union. Well, what that means then is, at least from that perspective, World War II only ended just a handful of years ago, because if the issue was the liberation of Poland, that only just happened.
That long view I almost takes brings back the phrase of the American century, and a look at our life in this country, all of us corporately speaking, from before World War I until the present. And it's, to me, very extraordinary remembering those times in World War II where to serve in the service was something that most young men burned to do.
Right.
And now they have a tendency, or they did, to burn draft cards because maybe we're just burned out. There have been 3 generations now, from World War I, World War II, Korea War, the Vietnamese War, and a lot of little brush fires here and there. And going back to that time of high courage.
Right, exactly right.
And a freely given courage. There was some born of desperation, but there was a great deal of just raw, we are saving the world for democracy.
Yeah, right or wrong, the perception is, and has been, that the World War II was the last completely righteous war, that the motivation was absolutely without question. And as I say, right or wrong, I'm not going to say anything about, you know, Korea and what followed, that there was anything wrong with the motivation. I'm just saying, in the popular perception, the Second World War was the last one that was completely righteous in its intent.
Well, I'd be interested to know when you and Bodie sat down and said to yourself, we're going to write an historical novel. Did you have a template to think of, or look back on, or some part of your experience that was your guiding light in deciding you wanted, number one, that you wanted to write historical novels, and number two, how you went about it, some process that you, procedural thing that made you say, yeah, we can do that, and we'll pick that particular thing to guide us?
I really think it has to do with what we learned from John Wayne again. And that is, we are not writing a history book. We're not trying to just retell the history of the period. And in fact, to borrow a very gracious quote, we just got a review of Twilight of Courage that said, the Thoenes have given World War II a face. And that is, you know, entirely the intent here. We want to look at the effect on individual people. And so we, excuse me, can pick out people who lived through those events, who were faced with really, you know, critical choices. Horst von Bachmann is a good example, is a German officer that we tell his story in Twilight of Courage. His role is to show the German perspective, and he is a very interesting, deep character because he is a patriotic German, meaning he's not prepared to be a traitor to his country, and yet he's not a Nazi, and disagrees extremely with what he sees going on around him. And yet he has to make this decision of, now, if I go against my government's policies, if I betray my oath as an officer, it may cost me my position, it may cost me my freedom, it may cost me my family, it may cost me my life. How far through that hierarchy am I willing to go in standing up for my beliefs? Now, see, that's, to us, that is the most interesting part, because it's not just the issue of the war itself or any one particular battle, but what are the personal struggles, internal and external, that people face?
The possible conflict there, and that implicit in that suggests to me that you're not going to lose track of Hearst von Borkman. You're going to bring him back.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. Certainly, again, a real person, a man who we know his real story, and one we think is worth retelling.
Is this someone that you were able to talk to personally?
No, he's dead. We had to pick up his story secondhand, but we do feel like we know him very well now.
And of the, how many people who were present during that event did you have a chance to talk to?
I would say hundreds. It's about as close as I can identify it, because it seems like we are always having encounters that many people would call chance that play such a big role in what we do that we can't think of it as chance. But just to give you an example, we were visiting what would be the equivalent of a Veterans Administration hospital if it were in this country, only this was in Paris. And we passed a little door in a corridor that was kind of shabby, really, and the lettering, the stenciling on the door was faded. It simply said, "Resistance." And we kind of walked by, and then we backed up and opened the door, and there was a little bespectacled man in a beret, probably about 65 years of age, and said, "Can I help you?" Well, what we stumbled into was the headquarters of the people who keep track of the French underground, and the people who actually, and so he was able to put us onto just a whole great number of people actually involved in the underground movement.
You chose to confine your drama to September and the assault into Poland in September '39, and ended it in Dunkirk. Now, there were a lot of choices you could have made there. You could have moved beyond Dunkirk or stopped short of it, or the Nazis entering Paris, any one of a number of moments.
Right.
Why did you decide that that would give you enough play, enough a field to play on that you were comfortable with and thought would come to a conclusion?
One of the things that I think drives a piece of well-written fiction, whether it's historical or something else, is bringing things to a focal point, starting with really diverse strands and seeing that they can all come together. And what happened at Dunkirk, where people from all over had to be evacuated right off the beaches and taken out of the path of this Nazi steamroller, that provided that kind of focal point, so that we could start in such diverse ways, as you referred to, the number of plot lines, and you think, well, how are these ever going to all tie together? To be able to bring them down to that pinpoint of what happened at Dunkirk really seemed to us to have the best dramatic possibilities.
This is a technical question about the process of gathering information. Right. You live in Lake Tahoe. I presume that the local branch of library in Lake Tahoe does not provide you with everything you need to do this kind of research. You have to go elsewhere to do it. What libraries did you go to?
The Imperial War Museum in London is one of our favorites. We have been able to get access to their photo archives I've talked about, and they have also transcripts of interviews with soldiers and so on that they keep on file there, and so that's a primary source for it. And there is the equivalent of that. It's called the Museum of the Armies in Paris, and we use both of those extensively.
We commend you for that. Those are classy
sources.
sources.
They are.
And this is Brock Thoene. The book is The Twilight of Courage. He and his wife Bodie have done a splendid job of bringing to life an extremely important part of our history.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.